Hello, I'm not one of the authors. I'm Stella Duffy. I'm a novelist, theatre maker, and the co-director of Imbalances, and I love this book. I genuinely do. I am a 57-year-old woman of working class origin, and I'm queer, and I've lived with a health condition of chronic pain for the last 20 years. And I've been in the arts since I was 18 when I got my equity card. And for all of this time, God, I literally might cry now. For all of this time, I have known I didn't fit. They didn't think I belonged. I wasn't quite welcomed in the same way that the primarily heterosexual, middle-class, white, able-bodied men were. And for years, I've tried to argue that with people who've said to me, no, Stella, you're just being oversensitive, and it's not really like that. And we're a wonderful, wonderful, inclusive thing, the arts. And these have often been people I love and dear friends of mine. What is so cool about this book is that for any of us who've ever felt that we didn't belong and we've been told we were wrong, these guys have worked out the numbers. We were right all along. They've added it up, and there's great stats in here, and I'm no statistician, but somebody I know is. And if you need the stats and the data to make your argument, it's here. So I'm going to ask these three, the authors of Culture is Bad for You, to each introduce themselves, and quite quickly perhaps, maybe you can get through it faster than I did, say why it matters to you that you've created this, because I know this has been a labour of love as well as a really important body of work. So who's going to go first? Somebody jump in.
Okay, hello. I'm Orian Brook. I'm the leadership fellow at the University of Edinburgh. I studied music at university, and I worked in arts venues, doing marketing in lots of venues in London, and then got more and more interested in audience research, and it just really sort of piqued my curiosity. But I came to an academic study of it a bit later, and I just got more and more interested in understanding all the forces that were shaping, influencing who had access to culture in all sorts of ways, whether that's participation, whether that's working, whose tastes mattered, whose judgments mattered, what the priorities were in terms of whether it was about reaching people who didn't normally attend theatre, or was it about was it about moving them, or was it about bums on seats, or was it about people who were sure that their tastes and interests were the most important, and that they were by themselves able to make judgments on whose other work should be seen. And so I was really interested in the sort of disconnect between the kind of sociological picture of understanding of the sort of social construction of cultural taste, and now we've been looking at that much more in terms of work, compared to a sort of policy understanding of that and what goes on in venues. And it's all this sort of, to some extent, the funders kind of saying, but why aren't you getting these people? And, you must be getting your leaflets wrong. It's like, well, there's quite a lot more to it than that. I guess that was really what got me into it.
There's a lot more to it than getting the leaflet wrong. That's a great takeaway. Okay, on my screen, Mark, you're next.
Okay, I can do some talking. So I think, as with Orian, I grew up with a lot of culture, fairly comfortably. In contrast to the story that you were telling, I fit in quite neatly because of what I look and I sound like. And one of the first jobs that I was doing when I was a student in the across breaks, I was working in a theatre, working as an usher. I was being paid less than minimum wage, and we'll come back to that. And so on the one hand, I was having these experiences at work where I was having a lovely time. People looked and sounded like me, and everyone was getting on, and it didn't really matter that we were being paid less than the minimum wage. But then when I was at university, I was getting these sort of other experiences, reading about axes of social inequality and how culture can reproduce things. And so fast forward 15 years, and what what I've tried to contribute to the book is thinking about how you can reconcile these things, how people working in the sector can have the best of intentions and really believe in what they're doing while not really fully getting their heads around the problem, which is something that I can speak to because I was one of them.
That's so brilliant. That's extremely useful, and we will absolutely get on to how can we help the men to make the difference. on to the next man, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Stella. So I'm Dave O'Brien. I have this quite sort of crazy job title of Chancellor's Fellow in Culture and Creative Industries at the University of Edinburgh. And I mean, it's a funny question, this, and I guess it kind of comes up when you write a book rather than sort of publishing lots of academic papers. When you publish an academic paper, it's really rare someone says, you know, well, what's your motivation? Why did you get into this? And I guess there's everything Mark and Orian have already said about, you know, the kind of the experience of inequalities and the distance between what policymakers or practitioners think is going on. But I also think there's, it sounds kind of a bit crazy, but a sort of like public duty with writing the book. And this goes back to the first project that was really where the book kind of got started, which was myself and a colleague, Sam Friedman, interviewed lots and lots of actors about what it was like trying to make it as an actor and what the labour market was like for actors. And this would have been like 2015, 2016, around then. And it became clear, you know, so I guess immediately just how powerful some of the stories we were getting. And they were stories of not just people's kind of, you know, hopes and dreams, but the way people had ploughed their entire lives and sense of vocations into these really difficult kind of struggles to make it, and how some of them, because of the social structures they found themselves in, were not just kind of, you know, less likely or whatever, but were actually receiving what we think of as kind of, you know, forms of marginalization, forms of abuse, just because of whether it's, you know, the color of their skin, their gender, their class background. And so trying to intervene, I guess, sociologically and with academic research in some of those, you know, moral debates that we see in the press about, you know, whether people aren't talented or aren't hardworking enough, I think is one of the motivations that kind of drives me in this book.
Sociological moral intervention. That's cool. I like that. Just to say,
Stella, I realised I didn't answer one of your two questions, which is who am I? My name is Mark, and I work at the University of Sheffield.
Thank you, Mark. Just for those of you listening, unlike the Zooms that you might all be used to, we can't see you, but there's a place to ask questions. And if they're coming to you, these questions that you're desperate to ask, do add them. I've got a little list of questions myself, but we are going to come to you at the end. So you don't need to worry about waiting until the end. So first of all then, and I'm not sure who wants to answer this, but what did you find out about arts attendance? So presumably it isn't just the leaflets, right? Are you going for this
so
one,
I can
Orian?
talk about this.
Great.
I think we've all contributed to all the different chapters, but as with any task, you know, somebody will have a first go, and then other people will come back to it. So there's kind of a long tradition in sociology, but also elsewhere, media studies, audience studies, and related disciplines in terms of understanding, you know, who likes what, who shows up at what, who engages in what in various different ways. And we drew on a few different, we thought about this in a couple of different ways. We thought about both broadly, you know, like who is the audience for theatre, how is the audience for various different activities socially stratified by things like gender and ethnicity and age and where in the country different people are. And in that, some of the findings were surprising and some of them weren't. You know, it won't come as a tremendous surprise to a lot of people that what you might refer to as the traditional art forms, things like classical music and drama and so on, have much, much larger fractions of people. Oh, you found it? Who can talk about chapter 4?
I love it. It goes with the opera.
forms, like these sort of traditional classical forms, are very heavily socially stratified. People that you might refer to as being in middle class roles are much more likely to be doing that. But the other thing that I think this figure sort of flags up, which is often a little bit less obvious, is that almost everything, films and cinema notwithstanding, only a minority of the population is even going. You know, when we're talking about going to the theatre, we're not saying, oh, you know, 90% of middle class people are going to this and only 60% of working class people are going. You can divide those numbers by 3. And more generally, I think when we're talking about the arts and arts engagement, it's when we're having these conversations as, you know, academics that are interested in this stuff, and with people that work in the arts, or people who love the arts and so want to see it be a more socially just environment, it's quite easy to forget that this is a marginal form, that more generally there's not as many, like, most people just aren't interested in this in any way. And like I say, when you're immersed in this world, that's easy to forget. So that's the first thing that I would say.
So I mean, even looking at this, right, the participation of 60% to film, but plays and dramas are way down at 23%.
Yeah.
And so I think we do think that, and I you know, my wife's a playwright. We live in an arts bubble, although she's an immigrant, and you know, so that's a whole other difficulty there. But it is easy for those of us in the arts, not least because of the precarity of being freelancers in the arts, to convince ourselves that we're doing this special and precious thing that everyone cares about. But that's not necessarily true, right? From what you guys have discovered.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that we looked at was the fractions of people going to different. So we weren't just looking at these broad categories like who's working in middle class jobs and so on. We were also looking at the behaviour of people who are actually working in the arts. You know, people in arts, literary, media jobs, and so on. And again, while this shouldn't come as a surprise, all of these people are way off the scale relative to almost any other cultural occupation. And when you combine this by looking at who are these people, and we'll come to this in a sec, and who are they hanging out with, their worlds are very, very different from the majority of the population.
Did you say way off the scale? How do you mean way off the scale?
So if, for example, you know, the average person, this is a bit crude, but you get the idea. If the average person goes to the theatre once every 4 years, the kinds of artists that we were looking at, you know, going to the theatre 3 times a year, it doesn't sound like a lot to people in this kind of conversation, but the average for people working in the arts was in that sort of ballpark, and that is 12 times the population average.
Wow. Okay, that I don't go to a lot of theatre myself anymore, because I got bored with it, because it was showing me the same people time and time and time again. She said, really annoying, all the theatre people, but I think they'll know what I mean. But that really interests me, because you're telling me that my going, and that's certainly more than 4 times a year, is huge compared to the average person.
I might come in on this and say, in some ways, that wouldn't matter at all. You know, people in the arts, there's a logic. You know, if you're going to work in the arts, you're going to be committed to it. You're going to be interested in it. You know, it's not kind of strange at all. But it begins to matter in some subtle ways, and then some less subtle ways. And I guess one of the ways it matters is that the arts are not a kind of representative group of people. So we see the kinds of inequalities that we see in cultural consumption. So, you know, levels of education, location, class and status, gender, ethnicity, that shape this kind of, you know, narrow section of the population who are really like intense consumers of the arts. We see similar trends in the workforce as well. And the kind of socially exclusive audience is matched by a socially exclusive workforce. Okay,
so that then to go on to what you've worked on the arts labour markets, the fact that the people are not turning up for the arts is replicated in who's working within the arts. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I can do. I'll tell you, Orian, can you skip forward a couple of slides?
Oh yeah, sure.
Sorry, do you want to go? Are we missing really important things? Don't make us miss terribly important things.
No, I was going to just sort of say about this kind of low numbers of people. It's not the kind of, it's not like everybody going to the theatre and that's all kind of really true. I think I would point out that that's not to say we're not arguing that the arts as a broad category is kind of insignificant, doesn't mean anything, or is actually a kind of trivial part of life. In fact, we have a whole chapter on why culture is good for you in lots of ways, and the ways in which it's been argued that it might be good for you. And the other thing that kind of the whole argument in the book is not just about the more the art forms that are maybe less popular than people working within them might imagine, but we're also talking about TV and kind of representations of society, whether that's on screen, whether that's in novels, whether that's in opera, or whether that's in advertising. That the kind of arguments about the exclusions that we're making and why they matter, what's causing them and why they matter, actually are pervasive to society, even if the most prestigious cultural pursuits are relatively rarely engaged in or exclusively engaged in. I guess
so. The exclusions are happening across the board, whether we're talking about absolutely populous telly or very, very high-end opera. Is that what?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, there might be differences in degree, but the same, but similar kind of mechanisms. I think it's fair to say. I don't know if Mark and Dave would disagree. But
yeah, telly's a really good example. Just because briefly, people working on the telly are coming from somewhere. A lot of people, actors. It's very unusual for actors on the telly not to have previously worked in theatre or to have been to drama school.
Right. Okay. There is I do want to go on to the labour markets, but there is a little bit to say about this, though, isn't it? That some of it's funded and some of it's not. And some of it is funded and it's not at all inclusive. And some slightly more of the stuff that isn't funded might be a bit more inclusive.
So, I mean, it's always really tricky territory once we get into questions of where the money goes, and we try and link them to questions of, I guess, like aesthetic or cultural hierarchies. And I guess one of the things we were really keen to do in the book is not set up a division between like funded, state supported, whatever you choose to call it, forms of culture, and then market driven forms of culture. And it just reinforces the point you just raised and the point Orian and Mark have just made as well, that it's not like when we look at the film industry, which gets some government investment, but is, broadly a kind of commercial enterprise, broadly speaking. It's not like that's, this kind of perfect utopia of, a highly representative, both workforce, representative, kind of images and themes on screen, and then a representative audience. The film industry, commercial music industry, have got the same kinds of issues, the same kind of problems as those, things that are going on at the Opera House, at the National Theatre, in, again, like places like publishing, I guess, are really interesting because, you've got parts of the publishing industry that get direct support in terms of like Arts Council grants and stuff like this, and then parts of the publishing industry that are like ruthlessly commercial, and yet it's dominated by posh white people. Like wherever you look, it's it's got these massive problems. And yeah, I mean it's really something we were really keen, kind of not to have these, I guess, false binaries between state and commerce, and in some ways, kind of high and low, because actually this is a problem for cultural production and cultural consumption more generally.
So culture across the board, high, low, state funded, not funded, is all exclusive.
I mean, we want to be nuanced.
I'm sitting on the exclusive, not there yet. Okay, I'm just going to answer this question because it's relevant. Somebody said, where do the stats come from? Are they in the book? Yes, they are. So are the diagrams. And just while we're here, somebody has asked, and you might be able to answer this, do you have comparative figures for attending football matches and subscribers to sports TV packages? You like talking about football?
Well, actually, the first thing, most of the stats are from kind of high quality government and nationally representative surveys. So the stuff on cultural consumption is from the Taking Part survey that DCMS runs. The stuff on the labour markets from the ONS's labour force survey. We did some of our own survey work, which we report on, looking at things like social networks and some attitudes and values, but we also use kind of nationally representative data sets there. So it's mainly kind of high quality nationally representative data.
But it's all in the book for them to access, though.
Oh yeah, it's all in the book. Almost all of it is in, where are we? The kind of third and fourth chapters. We kind of set out what the landscape is in terms of the problem. Yeah, and then we kind of drill down later on into terms of like people's experiences, and we try and explain the mechanisms driving some of the problems. In terms of football, Mark, has got some good stuff on what people do in terms of like how we think beyond just the arts.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is, have we got figures on who's going to football matches? The short answer is no. I'd love it. If was that a hand up or was that agreeing?
Yeah, well, that's actually, yes. I did an analysis of Eurobarometer, and which does have that, and and there are more people. I think, was it attending theatre or was it attending museums? I think it was theatre. There were in the UK more people attending theatre than attending football matches, marginally, and we were the only country in Europe where that was the case, in fact. So, but it didn't. Yes. Sorry, carry on with what you say.
So before I was working on this, in a slightly previous life, I was working on a project called Understanding Everyday Participation, sort of really bringing further in this idea of, we don't want to generate these false hierarchies. People spend their time in all sorts of different ways. It's not as if some of them are valid and some of them aren't. And going to football matches wasn't one of the things I was able to work with, but you can see huge amounts of what you might call everyday creativity from lots of different kinds of groups that tend to be less pronouncedly socially stratified than other things. It's not as if football matches have similar problems of, just being dominated by middle class people in the way that a lot of some of the things that we draw on are. But equally, I don't want to be too confident and say, oh yeah, it's football is a complete utopia where there are no problems. Dave can probably speak to that in a bit more detail.
I'm not going to let Dave do that because I'm really aware of the time and a bunch of questions. So let's move on to this, the labour markets. What did you find out about the arts labour markets?
I'll tell you what, I think the really interesting thing to say about the arts labour market is the kind of stuff we tried to do over time. So in some ways, I think the three of us will be really disappointed if anyone is shocked by the labour market data that we present. So, people should be well aware now that the arts are not ethnically diverse. Ethnic diversity in the cultural and creative industries more generally is driven by the IT industries. And when you get into stuff like, publishing, for example, there are some issues with the museums and galleries data in the 2019 labour force survey. You see like really unrepresentative sets of jobs. In terms of gender, it really varies. The film industry is catastrophically bad in terms of gender representation. But museums, galleries, and libraries seemingly are kind of doing quite well. But then, when we get later in the book to think about women's experiences, we know there's like a really clear glass ceiling for women in, say, the kind of contemporary art world in terms of who runs museums, this kind of stuff. But I guess our story, beyond that, is the fact that these things have been static for a really long time. Yeah, that's the perfect slide. Thanks, Orian. We try and drill down to look at kind of class imbalances, and what we see is that there's a domination of most cultural and creative occupations, apart from crafts occupations, by people from managerial and professional middle class, occupational, social origins. That social mobility doesn't seem to be great into these occupations. And actually, this has been pretty static since 2014. That's one set of data. And we've also used the census, or a kind of a subset of census data, to look at this since 1981. And even though there have been like massive changes in society since 1981, even though there are more middle class origin people in society, less working class origin people by occupation in British society, Britain is a more service driven economy and a less kind of, heavy industry, manufacturing driven economy, for example, to give, some examples of male driven working class jobs, although we talk about women and class later in the book. This persistent exclusion of working class origin people has been with us for at least 40 years, and one of the things, again, we're really keen to kind of demonstrate in the book and talk up in the book is that this is something to do with the cultural sector and these cultural jobs. We shouldn't just say, oh, this is like a sudden crisis in the last 5 years or whatever. These things have been, really long term, and partially they're to do with labour markets, but also they're to do with more, I guess, kind of complex and subtle things, which again is stuff we talk about later in the book.
And there's also stuff where you acknowledge, I've had quite a few people say to me, because of my age, but there was a golden age for working class people in the arts. That's not my experience, and it's not the experience of most working class people I know in the arts around my age. We didn't ever have a time where they went, come on in, we want you.
I mean, we talk about this at the start of one of the later chapters, where we absolutely don't want to say that particularly working class origin creatives who talk about maybe the mid-1980s as being a really, kind of fertile time for their practice. We don't want to say they're wrong at all, but we can see how they're unrepresentative. Some people will call this a kind of survivorship bias, but the time they were coming through was both different in terms of the structure of British society, but also they're extremely rare individuals to have made it at all, irrespective of their class, race, and gender. And actually, the normal story for a creative practitioner is that they don't even make it, kind of over 10 years, let alone make it for 40 years. And unfortunately, there does seem to be a kind of, a sort of an unrepresentative discourse that says, there were these moments in the past where it was, much easier. Actually, we want to say the story is it's always been really difficult.
Yes, somebody has actually asked the question, is it getting worse or is it just consistently bad?
That's a good question. And I suppose, in this moment, and we deal with this a little bit in the preface that we rewrote, quite hurriedly, lockdown started, there is potential for this moment to make things, demonstrably worse. But even then, what is likely to make things worse are the impact of long-term structural problems in arts and cultural institutions, occupations, labour markets, whatever sort of arena you want to think about. It's the long-term structures of those settings that are likely to be, accelerated by the impact of COVID, rather than COVID being like a unique moment.
And even before we look at COVID, it's we can say that, well, okay, the probability may not have changed if, say in 1981, I think we were looking at there that, somebody from a more privileged origin had about 4 times the chance of somebody from a working class origin of making it, and that hasn't changed. But the proportion of people from working class origins has reduced a lot, as Dave was saying. But what that's resulted in is the same probability, but a much smaller number of people from working class origins in these creative jobs, which means that there's more and more a kind of a lack of heterogeneity in terms of the backgrounds of the people in these jobs. That there's the domination is more complete of the sort of middle class origins.
I mean, I think one thing that it's important to say is that one reading of what we said, where we say, it's not that it's getting worse, it's not that we're at a sort of distinctly bad moment in history, it's that it's all always been bad. One reading of that would be, oh, well, it doesn't matter what we do then, because, you know, we've tried various different things. It's not as if this is a new problem, so let's whatever. It's just we'll just give up. That's not the story that we're telling. And part of that, you know, not to be sort of too negative, is that without the sort of interventions, without the things that people have tried, it might have got worse. And without the support and the work of people working in and around the sector, you know, we could give shout outs to organisations like Arts Emergency. They're doing a tremendous amount of really high quality work in this field. Things could be getting worse. And so when we say it's not getting worse, it's always been bad, that doesn't mean it doesn't make any difference what you do. It means the fact that it's only bad rather than getting worse is a consequence of a huge amount of work from a number of people.
Sure.
And there's also always a bit of a data lag. So it's like the fact that over those years it didn't get worse, it doesn't mean it's not going to get worse, or it's not already getting worse.
And I don't want people to be, you know, totally gutted by this, because I actually think that as I said at the beginning, what's lovely for me about this book is that it acknowledges a whole bunch of stuff that very many of us have lived is true, and therefore it gives us stuff to build on. That's why this is so valuable from my perspective. I do want to go on to my next couple of questions, but there's a couple of questions about universities, and given that you all know about them probably a lot more than I do, I'm going to ask them very quickly, and I'm going to give you a very brief time to answer them. What is the role of the universities in the reproduction of the inequalities? Given the stratified nature of the HE sector in England, at least, and UK more widely, do unis make things worse? Could there be a push to de-bourgeoisify, good term, the curriculum along the lines of decolonising the curriculum in humanities and arts subjects? And there's a following question from someone else, I assume. How does social background relate to education and the kind of job you get? Maybe working class people struggle to get jobs in the arts sector because in general they have a lower education level. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but anyway, there's a lot of inequalities in access to higher education is the rest of that. I
will answer that second question briefly, which is to say I did that as part of the analysis. It's not in the book, but it is in a paper that is referenced in the book, even actually if you are a graduate, so middle class people with a degree still have twice the chance of having creative work compared to working class people with a degree. So education, you know, because there are inequalities in accessing education, but it's not only about, well, we can only take people who have a degree and they're all middle class.
Yeah. So there are inequalities, but once you've been educated, and inverted commas, it's still unequal.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's also worth remembering as well, like we focus a lot on university because there is this important relationship between going to particularly universities and kind of getting into very prominent roles, particularly kind of, you know, prominent roles in stuff like acting, for example. But we've got a chapter in the book where we try and say, look, loads of this is done in childhood, and you know, it's childhood access to culture where we can see, you know, for those people from more, you know, kind of affluent, privileged origins, they, you know, they grow up just breathing culture. And you know, one of our kind of flippant sort of comments is, you know, well, everybody went to art classes, didn't they? You know, which comes out from one of our interviewees, versus people who are like, I was really lucky to have a good teacher because, you know, like growing up, my parents didn't know anything about the cultural sector. They didn't know you could get jobs in it. You know, like I really struggled to get access, this kind of stuff. So, you know, we're right to focus on universities because they have, you know, a really important role in determining who gets in. But sometimes we can miss what happens at, you know, age 5, age 10, you know, where you could say the damage is done, or you could say inequalities, you know, really assert themselves depending on your perspective.
And also what happens at those ages is depending on class and ethnicities and abilities. What we're doing is we're saying that you can create and you can consume. Because when we go, every child should get to go to the theatre, that's not the same as saying every child should get to act if they want to, or direct if they want to, or write if they want to. And they're two really different things. And the more privileged kids are getting to do both.
Yeah.
What are we really, sorry.
No, go on.
Yes, I was going to say, I think one of the important things about the question of is it getting worse, and actually looking at the stats to say, well, no, or but maybe, is that if we look at all the different policy interventions there have been, and people say, well, is it because of tuition fees, or is it because London is unaffordable, or is it because it's more difficult to get unemployment benefit? And actually, if you say, well, throughout all those changes, all these exclusions pre-existed all those policy changes, then maybe it's something about us, maybe it's something about the sector, and maybe we need to look at ourselves and what we're doing, and not only look at the outside world for the origin of these exclusions.
There have been a couple of questions saying, is it the arts? Is it us? Is it something about us? I want to move on to what is the experience of the people most marginalised, and that fits with a question that's just come in. For women and people of colour with established careers in the arts, what has your research uncovered about their treatment, e.g. bullying, abuse, racism, homophobia? I don't know if they correlate those questions, but I know you've got stuff about what it's like to be marginalised in the arts. Who's going for this one?
Yes, we do. So this kind of section A analysis we moved on to, that was based on 237 interviews done with people working in the arts that were taken from an original survey of about 2,500 people who responded about talking about their own creative careers and their own social backgrounds and so on. And so Dave was one of the interviewers, one of the many interviewed many people about this, and we selected some of the interviews of people who were socially mobile, and particularly we had a really interesting cohort of women of colour from who had been socially mobile in terms of coming from less privileged backgrounds and working in the arts. And so, yeah, we really consistently found this kind of them being given the message subtly or not so subtly that they didn't really belong, that there wasn't really, they were the only, they were the only person in the room, or they were only there because of some kind of diversity initiative, that must be why they got their funding, that they only got funded in order to do black work, do whatever their own heritage was. They, you wouldn't get a black woman being funded to write science fiction or something, that it was to fill a diversity niche. Yes, it's suspicious that they were only approached for partnerships when there was some particular funding available that was to do with diversity initiatives, and then there was then their success was viewed with suspicion kind of along that basis. So, I don't know, but Mark or Dave, if there's something you wanted to add to that.
Well, I'll tell you, we could probably bring up Rachel's story, actually, because that lays it out. And obviously, and this is probably the bit Stella has been looking forward to, it's in contrast to the experiences of white middle-class origin men. So we should not only think in terms of, I guess, the privilege in some ways of some of our respondents sharing these, in some cases quite traumatic stories of being marginalized, being reduced actually, to just their color or just their gender or just their class origin. But they're really thrown into sharp relief when we counterpose them with the stories of white middle-class origin men. And I guess maybe we'll tell Andrew's story, which I think next. Yeah, perfect. So, if Rachel was telling us about, every time she was at a meeting, she'd be like conspicuously the only black woman, particularly, from working class origin in the room. Andrew was telling us about how like he got his job, sort of like because he was, kind of lucky. In some ways, his, maybe his ignorance about a particular art form was maybe, something that was quite useful to him, in terms of like persuading people to be interested in it. And this is in real contrast to, I guess, narratives of struggle that we were getting from marginalized individuals. Some of this it relates to the literature on how, kind of white middle class origin men in Britain express themselves. They tend to be sort of self-effacing. They talk about, look, they tend to have these gentlemanly kind of stories of success. But what we were, I suppose, like most kind of troubled by, and I guess this is the kind of second part of Andrew's story, is that he was like in charge of the sector. He was the one who stood out as in charge of the sector. But when we were kind of asking him about, so you're in power, what can you do? He would tell us this like strangely sort of sociological story that we've been telling you. He'd say there are far too many graduates, so we have to take, quote unquote, the best person. And, that means the person who's best educated. And, we know that education is a proxy for many kind of inequalities. He'd talk about, well, if disabled people were turning up for the interview, if they were applying, I'd appoint them, but they're just not applying. And so even though, he didn't have any kind of experience of inequality, he really understood that there were these massive structural inequalities within arts and cultural jobs. And yet he told us there's nothing he can do about it. And it was that, I think, quite difficult combination of, self-effacing, lucky stories of how he made it versus the sense of like, but there's nothing I can do for anyone else, which, is kind of most frustrating.
And that speaks very clearly to a question that's here. Someone's saying, I think one of the main issues is being able to support yourself financially through the unexpected additional levels of education, precarious temp contracts, underpaid work, short-term posts, internships, blah, blah. If you're from a working class or disadvantaged background, in the heritage and museum sector, for this person in particular, that's a major issue. Did that come up a lot and I know this has come up in other stuff that you've done, certainly, where people, and it's to do with the belief that it's a meritocracy, right? They don't perceive that having the money to be at university, that having the parents who live in London perhaps so they can stay with them, they don't perceive those to be privilege.
So we have a chapter. We have a chapter in the book about working for free, and we introduce it by sort of talking about the fact that, in the survey work where we say, have you ever worked for free? Do you ever work for free? Pretty much everyone says yes. And so, you see that working for free is endemic in the sector. But through the interview work, we sort of started to break this apart, because what it is to work for free depends a bit on who you are and the sort of circumstances in which you find yourself. Because if what working for free entails is, you spend 6 months living in your childhood bedroom in your parents' house in London, it's a bit humiliating and you don't love it, but it's okay, and you get to make a bunch of it. You get to meet a bunch of interesting people and do a bunch of interesting work, and then at the end, it really contributed to a portfolio. And so this is something that you could have aimed for. This is part of the strategy, and you can make it work. Whereas for other people who maybe don't have that safety net of, there's a confidence that you can stay at your parents' house, maybe instead during the day you're doing an unpaid internship, but then in the evening you're having to work a bar job in order to be able to pay the rent in the pretty rough flat share in which you find yourself. What it is to work for free is quite different. And so when more senior people are saying, well, everybody has to work for free, like sort of not in a positive way, but they reflect on, well, I used to have to work for free and it was a shame, but, it paid off for me and this is how it's panned out. They're very, very different experiences. And we see some of our interviewees were telling us that they were getting sort of criticized at work. I say at work, they weren't being paid. They were being criticized at these cultural organizations for not being able to sort of reliably show up on time and all this preparation, whereas some of the other people on the internship program were getting paid, were consistently showing up on time and doing all this impressive work. And the reason why they weren't showing up on time is because they had been let out late from their actual paying gig.
Yeah.
And the story is the same with attitudes to meritocracy actually as well. And we see that same kind of problem of, everybody is like really heavily invested in the idea that the arts are a meritocracy, but the people that seem to be most invested in it are the people who are the highest paid and are thus the kind of maybe sort of least constrained by the problems in the sector.
Okay.
And this is also something that, I don't know if it comes onto this, but it also then really came into when we started looking at women and thinking about motherhood and planning, career planning and family planning and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great chapter as well, which I'm not going to go into now because we've got 12 minutes to go. However, it's relevant because what we know is that it's the senior men who need to understand, and going back to your Andrew, him just being nice and believing that he's doing his best is not enough, right? And I know it's not your job to fix it, but you've got all of this information now that we can all access. And genuinely, everybody, I'm not an academic. One of the other things I said today very early on was how brilliantly for me it read. It didn't feel like I was reading something that I was struggling to read. And I really mind that about academic texts, because then they make me feel stupid, like I don't belong in the book. And so what's really fantastic about this is it's, as well as it being useful, it's very accessible. But one of the things I think is interesting about this is that there's got to be things we can do, right? So we've got the information. What do you think we can do with it to help them? And I think they literally have to step aside. I mean, they have to do that thing of going, I can step sideways and support somebody to be doing what I've been doing and that I've had all of this other support before. They can do that. It's not impossible. Is that me just being daft, thinking that we could hope for that? Is it?
I think for me, it's, I mean, yes, there is a problem that I think it's for senior men who obviously, or people in senior positions, many of them are men who have the power to change things in some ways. But I also think it's up to everybody. It's up to all of us to recognize how people get lucky and how that luck is unequally distributed. And, you know, because everybody, even people from privileged backgrounds, still have to get lucky to have a successful creative career. But some people just get luckier than others. And so who gets opportunities, the social networks that operate, you know, the friend of a friend and the friend, you know, the my aunt's cousin's neighbour, all those sorts of things, how that luck is distributed and who gets the opportunity. So I think it's up to all of us and everybody in the sector to notice how that works and to think about it and for everybody to think about what they do. And then, yes, for people in positions of power, positions of who can change things, to think about, for example, diversity initiatives, which is always some low-level training job where the person leaves and the organisation doesn't change. And I don't know, Dave and Mark, if you had other...
I mean, it's really tricky, this, because in some ways, we're at a point where I guess the promise of creative industries as a policy moment has sort of gone, and we're grappling with, you know, the reality of these jobs, these institutions, whatever lens you want to look at them through. And, you know, initially when creative industries as a sort of policy moment started, they were full of optimism about, like, everybody will get an awesome job that is, like, fulfilling, you know, full of autonomy, and it'll be well paid, and it'll just be really interesting, and it won't be something that you don't want to do, and it won't feel like, you know, you're kind of working in an office or in a factory or whatever. And I think, you know, the loss of that optimism is a big issue here, because certain parts of the sector are autonomous. They're getting paid huge amounts of money. Some of them might argue they're taking large amounts of financial risk, for example, in the film or the theatre or potentially the publishing industries. But I think, you know, rather than saying, how do we sack a lot of senior people, how do we grow the pie? So, one, those senior people aren't the only ones making decisions. You know, there's good work, and we draw on some of this in the book, and we've got evidence in the book. But there's also some really good work by a whole bunch of the people we're citing that talks about, if you look at like TV commissioning or decisions about, like, you know, record labels or, you know, publishing house decisions, this is done by the narrowest section of the most elite people in British society. And, you know, it's not so much that we should get rid of them, but it should just be a much more diverse set of decision makers. And that's about growing the pie. So, you know, taking some of that optimism where creative industries were meant to be growing, in economic terms, in terms of new jobs, and saying, this growth has to be diverse. And then from that, we get things like initiatives, we get policy interventions. As we say in the conclusions of the book, though, I mean, that's the kind of benign story. Like, that's the sort of maybe like liberal story of change. And there is, another side to this that, maybe more radical voices will read the book and say, rip it up and start it again. And,
Okay.
we need to do things that are not just, kind of sitting with the existing structures, but actually are alternatives and in opposition to those structures.
We have a couple
imagine tomorrow, let's say that tomorrow every single person who works in the arts who gets paid more than 80 grand has read the book and they have a crisis of conscience and they think, I need to hand in my notice. In a year's time, if nothing else changes, in a year's time, the sector will look exactly the same.
Yeah.
Because the cohort of people coming in who take on those roles will be exactly the same. And so when you started saying that all of these people that we were describing, they could step aside, but that won't
support someone else to work with them. That's what I was saying. You have to step aside and make room for someone else and support the someone else. You can't just step aside, otherwise you're washing your hands of your responsibility.
Yeah, and so I think, as Dave says, there are these sort of two different ways in, and which one I think we each go in for depends a bit on what day of the week it is and what else is happening in the sector. But yeah, there's a sort of liberal version where people already in the sector are more proactive in working with other people and making sure that everyone has the support they need. But often that support isn't, oh, are you sure that you've done the accountancy training correctly? It's, am I sure that this board that you're going to inherit doesn't undermine you when you're doing the role? So that's part of it. But then sometimes we just think we just have to tear the whole thing down.
But somebody has said, is culture worth saving? Should we start again and build something new? I think the new's already there. I just think it's not always getting the light shone on it. I do believe it's there. It's certainly there at community level. It may not be there at the big shiny level. Okay, I've got a minute and a half before we're going to go back to Rebecca so she can tell people how to buy the book. But I just want to say this. Somebody has said, and maybe you've got one answer, what should be the carrot and what should be the stick for making change? Either a carrot or a stick.
I mean, we're in the middle of a stick moment, actually, with the Arts Council distributing emergency funding, and I think the stick, can be quite brutal. Something that came up earlier in the week was the idea of the state funds or supports arts organisations to take risks creatively, and we might say, well, if you're not willing to deliver on making an organisation look more like the rest of the population, then you shouldn't be allowed to take risks. Hiring, say, staff from working class origins, that is not taking a risk, and it's really offensive. And we detail this in the book, how certain social groups are kind of constructed as risks to be, taken with or gambled on. That isn't risk taking. So, one stick can be, if you don't deliver, we won't give you any money. And the thing is, Arts Council England, Creative Scotland, the Arts Councils in Wales and Northern Ireland can do that as state funders, but audiences can do that as well. They can say, we're not going to turn up, we're not going to buy, we're just going to say no. So that's, one form of stick, I guess.
I have a carrot, and my carrot is that we'll get better culture when more people are creating it. It just will be. It will be better because it will be more that. I don't have a word for that. Thank you, all three of you. I will say it again, I think this is brilliant. Hey, look, I nearly didn't swear out loud. And I am genuinely grateful for the work that went into this. And I think it can make a lot of difference for many of us, but we have to take it and work it. We can't just go, oh, there's a book about it. So Orian, Brook, Mark Taylor, David O'Brien, thank you all so much. Thank you very much to the people who sent in questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of you. And to the one who wants to know how the book relates to Bourdieu's arguments,
That's a no.
Oh, yes,
on Twitter. You talk to them on Twitter, because I'm like, back to Rebecca from Manchester University Press, who can tell you how to buy the book and pre-order it, because it comes out on the 14th of September.